Hello, my name is Johnny, and today I'm going to talk to you about the life of Joseph Stalin, how he was born, his early life, his rise to power, and his eventual death, and the effects he had on not just the Soviet Union and Russia, but the rest of the world. So, who's Joseph Stalin? So, Joseph Stalin, originally named Joseph Vissarionovich Zhugashvili, he was a key member in the Bolshevik Party. He was also he was also a communist ruler in the Soviet Union from 1922 until his death in 1952. And he was known for ruling the Soviet Union with an iron fist. So Stalin's origins. So in fact, Stalin was born in Georgia, not Russia. Stalin's parents, their names were Visyan and Ekaterina Shugashvili, were former serfs during the serf era in former Russia. And Stalin's father was a shoe cobbler who regularly abused Stalin, and he was also a drunk. His mother was a cleaner who had dreams of Stalin becoming a priest. When Stalin was just 5 years old, his father left him to go work in a shoe company in Tiflis, the capital of Georgia. Due to this, he was forced to move in with a priest. His name was Father Charkiviana. Stalin at the time only spoke Georgian, obviously, because he was from Georgia, or Georgia. So he learned Russian while he was in school. At the age of 9 is when he started, and then at the age of 14, Stalin contracted smallpox. And although he did recover, this left him with a permanent scars on his face. During this time, it was rare for children of Stalin's status to receive an education. So when his mother found out that he was able to go to school, she bought him the nicest clothes she was able to afford, hoping that it would help him fit in and not be bullied for his social status. However, this new form of clothing actually did the opposite and caused others to bully him. This caused Stalin to not only rebel against his mother, but also start to resent those who bullied him and stand up against them and his mother. As he grew, though, he realized that his mother at least stuck around and cared for him, and tried her best to make do with what she had, and in turn he focused his newfound hatred on his father for leaving him and his mother. So Stalin's education. So Stalin attended the Gory Spiritual School, and for his first 2 years, he was forced to take Russian, as I explained earlier, to catch up to his peers around him. Near the end of his second year, however, his father took him out of school, forcing him to go work in a shoe factory. This is where Stalin had his first run-in with capitalism, and it helped open his eyes to the difference having an education would have. Eventually, his mother was able to bring him back to finish schooling, and eventually he wouldn't see his father ever again. After finishing his tenure at the Gori Spiritual School, the headmasters there recommended he attend the Tbilisi Spiritual Seminary at the capital of Georgia. The Tbilisi Spiritual Seminary School brought in people of all nationalities, so while attending, Stalin being a Georgian was actually a minority. During his tenure there, he excelled in his first year, but his second year he started to study socialism and ignore his studies. At the end of his second year, he abandoned taking his final exams and was expelled. He later tried to pass it off as being expelled for reading the Communist Manifesto. Once he was kicked out, however, he started to work at his first and only job, besides all the roles he had in politics. His job was at an observatory where he taught private lessons there. While, while he wasn't working at his private lessons, he started to dive deeper into socialism and more into Marxism as well. So a little bit about Stalin's family life. So Stalin met his first wife, Ekaterina Svandovich, through a friend he met at the Tbilisi Spiritual Seminary School. Stalin immediately fell in love with her and eventually married her when she was 16. That same year she gave birth to her son Kato, and a year later she died due to tuberculosis. He met his second wife, Nadia Alilova, nicknamed Nadia, during the October Revolution, when both of them were working under Lenin. They had two children named Vasily and Svetlana. Their marriage only lasted 12 years and ended in Nadia's suicide. There are reports that this was due to her depressive state, as Stalin was abusive and flirted with other women. To make matters worse, his children's lives weren't any better. His first son attempted suicide, and Stalin mocked him for this due to failing. And when his son was captured by the Nazis, Stalin refused to try and bring his son back. His second son died to alcoholism, and his only daughter, years after his death, defected to the United States, as she was constantly kept under control by the Soviet Union. As previously mentioned, while Stalin was working in the observatory, he spent more and more time studying socialism. There, he started to hate capitalism more and more, and while working at the observatory, he began to write for Marxist newspapers. But this was brought to an end when police raided his home, forcing him to go on the run. While on the run, he still decided to write those Marxist newspapers. Eventually, he changed names to Koba, whose origins date back to a fictional Georgian vigilante. During the time, he joined a group of Marxists called the Bolsheviks. When Stalin first joined the Bolsheviks, he would help rob banks and was constantly being arrested and sent away and escaping. Eventually, he changed his name to Stalin, which meant "man of steel," to signify his iron will. During the October Revolution, Stalin had a minor role overall. At the start, he helped push the beliefs of Lenin that there needed to be an overthrow of the government in the papers that he wrote. During the Civil War, Stalin could be described as Lenin's enforcer. He helped grow the army and quote-unquote helped get rid of spies, which were former white army soldiers. However, many believe that this was just due to the fact that he didn't like them and believed that they were actually hurting them rather than helping them. With the end of the Civil War came the victory of the Bolsheviks. This came with Lenin coming into power over all of Russia. Stalin then was appointed General Secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party. Stalin at the time could be described as influential and able to move pieces behind the scenes as he saw fit. When Lenin suffered a stroke, both Stalin and Leon Trotsky, Lenin's right-hand man and best friend, knew that it was time to be ready to take over. Many believed that Trotsky would be Lenin's eventual successor, as like I previously mentioned, right-hand man. And this caused Trotsky to underestimate Stalin, believing that the battle was over before it started. However, this was far from the truth. After the stroke, Lenin was bedridden. While stuck to his bed, he knew that there would be a power struggle when he passed. Lenin wrote during this time about not wanting Stalin to be at the reins, as he believed that he already had too much power to handle, and he believed that someone should replace Stalin at the role he had now. When Lenin died, however, things could have gone worse for him and for Trotsky. Trotsky at the time was not in Moscow, and when he was informed of Lenin passing, he was told that the funeral would be held right away. Stalin planned this to show that Trotsky had disloyalty to his late friend, and he wasn't fit to rule. While this was going on, Stalin appeared devastated at the loss of his friend. But I think we could all agree that he was most likely overjoyed that he was able to put things in his own way. Stalin was eventually able to become the dictator of the Soviet Union, and one of his first orders of business was to exile Trotsky. He did this as Trotsky was going against many things that Stalin wanted to accomplish. So Stalin and his loyal underlings decided to launch a propaganda against Trotsky. An example of this, as I previously mentioned, was his disloyalty to Lenin. Trotsky was forced to step down from his post, and then Stalin had him exiled to Mexico. Eventually, Stalin sent servicemen to assassinate him. With Trotsky out of the picture, he was able to consolidate control of the Communist Party. Now with Stalin in charge, the Soviet Union, although governed by communism, was governed under a form dubbed Stalinism. Stalin established a dictatorship with him at the center, obviously, and would oust anyone who went against the party. In other words, he would oust anyone that went against him. Stalin wanted to remain in power for as long as possible by any means possible. The key difference between Stalinism and Lenin's Marxism is that 1. Stalin wanted Russia to become great and powerful before helping other countries and spreading communism. He then enacted many reforms like collectivizing agriculture so that they worked for the country and not for profit. He also made society classless, which went against socialist ideology. Stalin then backed this up that in order to prevent the country from breaking down, the state itself must be strong. And really, when I'm talking about the state, what I truly mean is that Stalin himself, he wanted himself to be stronger, in turn justifying his dictatorship. In order for Stalin to have more power, he had some masterful control of the party. Even with Trotsky out of the picture, Stalin was paranoid. He started to oust those that were part of Lenin's original Bolshevik party. This was because, while Stalin was on the rise, many questioned his authority and questioned if he was fit to rule. This large exile was dubbed the Great Purge, with almost 1 million being killed and millions being sent to the gulags. It seemed like no one was safe, as Stalin even sent a few of his in-laws to the gulags, as he questioned whether they had loyalty toward him. For going against Stalin and his government, there were a number of punishments, the main one being the gulags. The gulags were forced labor camps in Siberia. At the camps there were never really barriers, to be exact, to keep the defectors in Siberia, as Siberia was such a remote part of Russia that if you did try to escape, the chance of you dying were extremely high, whether it was the weather or you escaping and having to fend off in nature and not die, because it was so far away from cities that either you're gonna die from nature, animals, or troops. The other form of punishment was just plain exile, like for example Trotsky with him being exiled to Mexico, or just you being quieted down by just assassinating you right away. Life under Stalin could be described as predictable. There was harsh censorship of citizens, only allowed to read or listen to state-approved things. Those who tried to read something that they weren't supposed to were quote-unquote sent away. Education was changed with an emphasis on Soviet history and Stalin's involvement in the revolution. Children were forced to join public groups, and religion was discouraged, as it made someone out to challenge Stalin's power. Women lost the few rights that they gained under Lenin, and Stalin put an emphasis on family, as he believed that this was his idea of a perfect Russia. Things weren't all bad though. The state paid for married couples to have children, again to further encourage the idea of Stalin's perfect Russia, and the standard of living rose as healthcare was paid by the state, and more people were able to get jobs as Stalin made pay better for everyone else. As previously mentioned, collectivization was the idea of agriculture industry working for the country and not for profit. This drastically failed, however, as all of their product was forced to go to the state. Since all the product was forced to go to the state, they didn't have any product left over for themselves. Millions weren't able to afford the food, and millions couldn't survive off what they were given by the state. This caused a huge famine to happen, resulting in the starvation and death of millions. Also, since there was such a big emphasis on unity in the country, it was encouraged to rat out those that were going against the government. This caused there to be distrust within everyone around them. It got to the point where you couldn't even trust your own neighbors. So although the standard of living was risen, there was also a negative in the fact that millions were being killed and trust was broken around everyone around them. Now remember earlier in the slideshow, I talked about one of the key ideas of Stalinism. One of the key ideas was to expand Soviet power before spreading communism throughout. Well, now the Soviet Union had amassed a great deal of power, expanding their military, and they were ready to start spreading communism. They set their eyes on Eastern Europe and were ready to do it. And then Hitler came to Stalin with the proposal to help attack Poland and split the country between them. Stalin was joyed with this idea. Not only that, but he had a treaty with Hitler to not attack each other. Now, at the time, World War II had not yet started. Conflict was slowly arising now, as Hitler was doing things like annexing parts of Czechoslovakia, bringing troops back into the Rhineland, and increasing the military. England and France were ready to put their foot down if Poland was invaded. And with this attack, Poland was invaded, so it marked the start of World War II. Now, World War II started in 1939. Throughout the war, Britain and France warned Stalin that Hitler would eventually betray him and double cross him. Stalin didn't believe these remarks though, and that ended up costing him, because betraying him, Hitler infected. In 1941, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa. Hitler used his blitzkrieg tactics to invade the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union were unprepared for this, and Stalin knew this. The Nazis started gaining ground fast, and eventually it seemed like the Soviet Union would fall. However, Hitler got cocky. Let me give you a brief explanation of how Hitler captured parts of the Soviet Union so fast. So Hitler obviously used the method called blitzkrieg, where he launched an army into them. But he also used a method called encircling movements to surround an army, forcing them to surrender. Since they were always outnumbered, they were forced to surrender, as eventually they would fall. Now, a key part of Operation Barbarossa was cutting off the oil supply coming in from the Crimea. This is where Hitler got cocky. The army that was supposed to complete the encircling movement, the cutting off movement of the Crimea, was almost finished, so Hitler divided the army. The army that was supposed to complete the cutoff weren't able to once they got to Stalingrad. Stalingrad saw some of the worst battles in the war for 2 years, and the Nazis were not able to conquer Stalingrad. As previously mentioned, the Battle of Stalingrad saw some of the worst of the war. However, all the time fighting gave the Soviets time to build reinforcements. As I previously mentioned, Hitler got cocky. To make matters worse, when the harsh winter of Russia set in, Hitler told his troops to keep marching on. The troops were not properly equipped for the weather and paid the price. Many froze due to hypothermia. The gasoline inside of the cars sometimes froze, and they were forced to leave dead troops on the side of the road to be able to where they were going. And to top it all off, Stalin called in troops from Siberia that specialized in cold climate fighting. So this kind of hurt quite a bit. And then, while all this fighting was going on, Stalin began to increase productivity for tools for the army to increase their power. Eventually, the reinforcements were ready, and they could run Stalingrad. Using movements mimicking Hitler's encircling, the Soviet Union were able to push the Germans back and regain lost ground that they lost at the start of the Operation Barbarossa. Eventually, the Germans were being pushed back more and more. Fighting on two fronts was starting to take its toll on the Germans, just as it did in World War One, and the Soviet Union just kept marching on. Eventually, the Soviets entered Germany, and then they were at the steps of Berlin. The war would be finished, and Hitler would pay. But then, reports came of Hitler's suicide. At the time when Hitler committed suicide, there were reports that came out that Stalin's secretary immediately ran to wake him up, as Stalin was napping at the time. And when informed of Hitler's suicide, all he said was, "Pity we could not take him alive. Now let me rest for the parade that is soon to come." Now that the war was over, it was time for the victors to come together and discuss the outcome and what to do next. Each one of them, whether it was Winston Churchill, Franklin Roosevelt, or Joseph Stalin, each came with a different agenda, with their own goals in mind. Stalin, with his agenda, wanted to reclaim the lost land he lost from Germany, and he wanted to gain the land that was in Eastern Europe that he hadn't touched yet. Roosevelt wanted the United Nations to prevent something like this from happening again, and Churchill just wanted things to go back to normal. Stalin, at the time, wasn't really seeing eye to eye with Roosevelt and Churchill, and originally they didn't agree with giving him all the land that he wanted. But Stalin did force their hand by bringing up the topic that if it wasn't for him, the war would still be going on. So Roosevelt, forced to yield in order to appease Stalin, had to give up and buy into his demands. Now, although the war was over and the Soviet Union was able to claim large sums of land, this victory didn't come with a cheap cost. More than 30 million Soviets were killed. This doesn't include just soldiers but also civilians. More than 1,700 towns were destroyed, not including villages. But the Soviets were again able to claim a large hold on Eastern Europe, with the only exception being that they hold fair elections. And when I mean fair, I mean democratic elections, of course, but the communists ended up rigging it so that communism would end up taking over in the countries. So when you think of Stalin, President of the United States, you would think that they have a rocky relationship. I mean, on one hand, we have the man who ruled Eastern Europe with an iron fist, and on the other, we have the man who embodied the epitome of freedom. But I guess you could say this is a little bit further from the truth. I mean, Stalin respected Roosevelt greatly, and when Roosevelt sadly passed away, Stalin was actually deeply, not deeply, but you could tell that he was distraught about this. He had great respect for him and believed that although he passed, his cause would still continue. On the other hand, when it came to Harry Truman, he believed that he worsened relations with the Soviets because his ideology was different than Roosevelt, and Stalin didn't like it because Roosevelt and Stalin, although didn't agree with each other, they both knew that they needed each other in order to succeed. But Harry Truman didn't believe this and believed that the US would be able to do things on their own without the help of the Soviet Union. So, Stalin's relations with England were somewhat similar to the relations he had with Roosevelt and America, because just like how he respected Roosevelt, Stalin admired Churchill and believed he was a feisty man that was fun to have conversations with. But with England, on the other hand, he truly never trusted England and always felt like they were keeping secrets from him, which obviously they were, because I mean the Soviets were keeping secrets from him as well. And Churchill believes that it would be hard to make progress with Stalin because of the type of man he was. But Stalin believes that this was actually not just England's fault, but capitalism's fault. He actually believed that the war broke out due to capitalism. He he ended up stating later on after the war that the war broke out due to capitalism because uneven development in capitalism leads to disturbance in equilibrium. And when capitalistic countries start to run low on materials, they simply do what he calls expand their sphere of influence. He then goes on to say that the war proves that the Soviet system is a viable system that was made for the people by the people. So after the war at the Yalta Conference, one of the main things discussed was about what to do with Germany. They didn't want a repeat of what happened after World War One to happen again. So they discussed staying occupying Germany, not ruling over Germany, but staying there and helping them recover from the war. They agreed in between France, England, the United States, and Soviet Union to divide Germany into four separate parts, and to divide Berlin as well into four separate parts. And then, but then this is where things kind of took a turn for the worse, because the United States, England, and Britain, and France obviously are all part of the free world, as they called it, in democracy. So they united their parts of Germany and Berlin into West Germany. This angered this angered the Soviet Union as they believed that everything should have been divided and not equal. So or not equal, but divided and separated. So what they did is they formed a blockade around West Berlin so that the free world was not able to bring supplies into them. They believed that this would cause them to give up on Berlin and hand it over to the Soviet Union, and thus the Berlin blockade started. So as tensions continued to rise, what the West ended up doing is that they started to fly airless, airless supplies into West Berlin, and obviously the Soviet Union couldn't do anything to take them out, or it'd be a signal of war again, and nobody wanted that. So eventually, the Soviet Union gave up on the blockade as they believed that the West would not stop bringing in supplies to them. As previously mentioned, after the Yalta Conference, one of the compromises that the Soviet Union came with Eastern Europe was holding democratic elections in the countries they had. But they actually called the countries puppet states eventually. So these democratic elections, if they weren't won by the communists, eventually
led to communist uprisings with communist governments taking over. This was seen in countries like Bulgaria and Romania, where uprisings did happen when a democratic election didn't go into the communist favor. Churchill then dubbed this the Iron Curtain, saying that a divide would be happening all throughout Europe from the free democratic states and the puppet states of the Soviet Union. And then from there, the Soviet Union's plans were to expand to the rest of the world, whether it was Asia or into the Middle East, and we'll see into that later. As previously mentioned, the Soviet Union wanted to spread communism throughout the world. They started out with them encouraging Kim Il Sung, who would eventually become the ruler of Communist Korea, to attack the Democratic part of Korea. This angered the United States and forced them to intervene. This sparked the start of the Korean War. A couple years prior to this, Ho Chi Minh, who would eventually become the North Vietnamese communist ruler, went to the Soviet Union to study under Stalin and learn more about socialism and Marxism. At the time, though, Stalin was focused on Europe and instead passed them off to the Chinese, as they had a history of working with the Vietnamese and wanted communism to still spread, which eventually communism did spread into Vietnam and led to the beginning of the Vietnam War. As previously mentioned, Eastern Europe was in disarray. After with first the Nazis taking over and then eventually the communists taking over, Stalin believed he could change Eastern Europe for the better. He first started off with the Baltics. He believed that having territorial control over there would help with supply lines and prevent Britain and Turkey from weakening them. There was also beliefs that the Soviet Union wanted parts of Turkey and eventually Iran because they wanted to increase their role in the Middle East. And as previously mentioned, they wanted to spread communism, so what better way than by having a country in the Middle East to help support them? So as previously mentioned, the Soviet Union wanted to control Turkey as they saw Turkey as a key country and wanted to control it in hopes that if if anything ever happened, like a blockade or anything like that, they'd still have access to the Mediterranean Sea and were able to access supplies to it. And then, on the other hand, there was also the spread of communism to states like Italy and France, with small uprisings happening there. At the time, though, Stalin didn't really encourage it or spoke out against it, and he he also stated that he in fact didn't even see France as a threat, as he believed that they didn't really do much to help him out in the war. When talking about life for puppet states, so countries like Bulgaria or Romania, you can compare their the lives of people there to the lives of the peasants in the Soviet Union. They had many things similar because they wanted to start communism, obviously. So whether it was universal or not universal, but more accessible healthcare or classless systems, everyone was treated almost as equals, and even equals to the Russians. And even when there were things like revolts or anything like that, they were treated the same. They were either silenced, killed, or sent to the gulags. So overall, life for puppet states were somewhat similar to those in the Soviet Union. And examples of this as well were an increase into nationalism and also more not just job security but also less trust into your neighbors as well. As I previously mentioned, exactly like the Soviet Union. So the story behind Stalin's death is, I would say, somewhat of a tragic one. So Stalin came back to his bed late at night a drunk after drinking loads of alcohol, and the following day when he hadn't woke up, nobody dared to disturb him in fear of him getting mad towards them. Eventually, someone came into his room and found him on the ground. They eventually sat him back up on the bed and called in the doctor. The doctor then revealed to them that he had suffered a terrible stroke and most likely wouldn't have long to live. And just like Lenin at the time, Lenin when Stalin came to power, there was beliefs that there would be a huge power struggle. And after he passed away, there was nationwide mourning for 4 days. So when Stalin passed away, the other countries, to be exact, the countries of the West, reacted by just letting the Soviets mourn. They didn't really want to increase tensions, so they just told those that were near communist countries to just ease up and let the time pass. In fact, some people could argue that the tensions in the Cold War lessened because, as Churchill stated, he believed that Khrushchev was an easier man to negotiate with. As as Stalin passed away, Khrushchev eventually took over the reins. So this man is Georgy Malenkov, and he was with Stalin since the Bolshevik Party first came to power, so quite a while. So he was Stalin's chosen successor, and after Stalin passed, was the ruler, as you could say, of the Communist Party. He was often underestimated by other communists and believed that he wouldn't do much while in power. But eventually, he created his own downfall because while Stalin created lots of reforms, Malenkov began to cut down on many of those reforms, angering many of the people that were firm believers in Stalin. This caused someone like Khrushchev to start to cause uprisings against him and force him out of office. So as previously mentioned, Malenkov started to cut down on things that Stalin did, like cut down on military spending and lessen on political repression. This angered many, and Khrushchev used this to his advantage. He created a coalition with old military officials and other people who supported him to usurp Malenkov and force him out of power. Eventually, he forced him out of the Communist Party, and this angered Malenkov. Malenkov tried to revolt and failed. This ended with him being kicked out of the Communist Party entirely and forced to work at an electro-hydro plant in Kazakhstan. So eventually, what became the transition from Stalin to Malenkov only lasted 2 weeks really, and it is now normally known as Stalin to Khrushchev. Stalin from now on would be well known for helping establish the Soviet Union into the superpower that it was until its eventual downfall. He helped spread communism throughout the world, even though it was negative and resulted in the wars of many others, whether it was the Korean War, the Vietnam War, or even the Afghanistan War. You could tie them all back to him somehow. He was also responsible for the deaths of millions, whether this was during the war, the Great Purge, or just throughout his time silencing those who spoke out against him. So Khrushchev finally at the helm, he he did things that were against what Stalin did, but still pleased many. So one thing he did was lessen restrictions created by Stalin. So example of this were like censorships. He limited the restrictions and gave some people more freedom. He wanted to return more to a Lenin-based ideology and dive away from Stalinism. So he wanted to go more into Marxism, which is what Lenin originally wanted. And then very little change for puppet states, as previously mentioned, because puppet states were equal to Russian states, really. So if anything changed for Russian states, then it changed for puppet states. So since nothing changed for the Russian states, nothing really changed for the puppet states. This concludes my presentation on Joseph Stalin. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you learned a few things about him.